All right, here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of Super. I'm taking that one more time. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, many of us think of ourselves as nerds, as geeks, and for some that is a recent development. For others, we have been so since birth. And we love to talk about the things that geeks love, but we haven't really gotten a chance to step back and talk about how did we become geeks? Is this just part of who we are? Can you make yourself a geek? Well, I'm really honored today by saying our special guest is Mandy Kaplan, a comedian, a musical theater performer, and arranger of cabaret nights in Los Angeles, and who also has a podcast called Make Me a Geek, in which she has been inviting people, including myself, on to kind of introduce her to different kinds of favorite geek media, TV shows, video games, movies, all the rest. And I've so enjoyed getting to be on her podcast that I wanted her to come on mine and talk about this whole process she's been going through. So, Mandy, why don't you start by saying hello and introducing yourself?
Well, hello. I am Mandy Kaplan, and my podcast is called Make Me a Nerd,
Make me a
Matthew.
nerd. Sorry, I shouldn't
I
have read
hate
that.
to give you a demerit right off,
I
but
mean, I think generally when I'm generally when I'm in introducing a host, I should probably introduce them properly. So yes, no demerit received.
okay. And someone keeping score, I imagine.
There we go. There we go.
But yeah, my deal is that I'm a mainstream mom. I love Taylor Swift. I love Housewives. I love fantasy football. And I have shied away from or been afraid of Dungeons and Dragons and Star both Trek and Wars and
Mm-hmm.
all of nerd culture. I've just kept my distance. And when I was turning 50, I thought there's a reason why everyone in my life loves this stuff. And
Yeah.
I'm going to crack it. I'm going to figure it out and I'm going to try these things I've never tried, which has led me down such exciting roads and discoveries of things I can really relate to. You have been such a successful guest. Well, 2 out
Thank
of
you.
3 ain't bad, but we watched, The Orville, which I loved,
Mm-hmm.
and, The Penguin, which I absolutely worshipped, but, I'm realizing there's so much I love about all of this stuff,
Yeah.
and some of it is a bridge too far, but
No, and I totally get that. I think it's really interesting to have this conversation. I'm just a few years younger than you. I'm almost 48, and you know, our generation, I think, grew up at a time when, like, if you read comic books, if you're really into Star Wars, like, there was a couple of kids at our school who were that. I was certainly one of those kids, and I got stuffed into lockers a lot, because of
Mhm.
that kind of thing. Metaphorically, not literally, but
There's still time.
yeah. I mean, well, I'm kind of a large
With
guy.
all
They
these
need to.
demerits you're gonna be getting,
I
Matthew,
if they build a locker big enough,
I'll
but
shove you right in there.
there you go. There you go. But like it's been fascinating to me, and especially on some of my other podcasts, Star Wars Generations, especially getting to talk to the folks who are growing up in a time where like reading comic books is cool, knowing comic books is cool. The MCU is one of the biggest movie franchises out there, with Star Wars a close second. And so it's been really interesting to me getting to hear from you as well, talking about approaching this at a different point in life instead of having grown up with it. And so let me just kind of start by asking you, for you, when you started this process, like what did the word nerd mean to you? Like what did you have in mind when you thought, I want to explore this world that I haven't poked my head into before?
Well, I know this isn't popular amongst some nerds, but I love The Big Bang Theory, and I think
Mm-hmm.
it inspired a lot of this, and that's what I think of, people who love not only playing a video game, but going to conventions for said video game and getting the comic books and wearing the T-shirts and, you know, doing cosplay. All of those things I saw as nerdy, and Big Bang Theory made me think, but they look really fun. And
Yeah.
they look like ways to really bond with people and make lasting friendships. And I like
Mm-hmm.
people and friendships.
Yeah.
So I think I was inspired by that. But I know that, for example, my sister is a huge nerd and she just hates the Big Bang Theory and thinks it's very insulting to nerd
Mm-hmm.
culture. So I know there is that camp.
Yeah.
So
Also, just letting you know, my camera has unplugged itself for some reason. I will try and fix it later, but just I'm
I'm
still
so
here. I
used to your
promise.
avatar. It's okay.
There you go. There you go. No, I get that, and I'll say I'm definitely one of those who is not a fan of the show because I think it's often made by people who aren't geeks but who are kind of making fun of it. But I love that you're kind of like the exception there, and that, like, for you, you seem to really enjoyed getting in on the joke, because I do think there is a lot of celebration of those parts of the culture, even if often they're poking fun at it in ways that I don't love. Um, but so yeah, and we'll get into more specifics in a bit. But now that you've kind of been on this journey for what? Has it been about a year since you started this podcast? Six
Yeah,
months?
coming
Okay.
up on a year.
What's been your experience with it so far?
Um, Tons of fun,
Mm-hmm.
tons of uh in a way proud of myself for really trying things I would never have tried based
Right.
on the description on Netflix. Sci-fi fantasy, I'm out.
Yeah.
And just opening my mind and opening my heart and finding such fantastic shows and movies and books and um yeah, I mean, I there are specific things I love, specific entities that I'm
Mm-hmm.
really drawn to, but moreover, I am an old dog and I'm learning new tricks.
Yeah. And I think that's great. I think that goes in all directions. Earlier we were talking about our shared love of cooking shows, and you mentioned Taylor Swift, something that I've definitely probably rejected for far too long, in part because I had a sort of, oh, commercialized pop music is bad, but also just some, misogyny about female pop singers and the like, and the way society dismisses them. And she's someone I've come to love. My spouse has introduced me to One Direction and the joy of the new generation of boy bands, though I'll
Mhm.
always be a Backstreet Boy at heart. But I think there's something great about being willing to kind of branch out and explore new things, especially at this point in time right now, where part of why I think it's such an interesting question is, I think if you ask a lot of people what is nerd media right now, you're going to get a very broad answer.
Yep.
Because, for example, just I think you recently did an episode on Andor, right?
Yep.
In Star Wars, and granted, there's some debate about this right now, but within Star Wars in the last year, we've had a spy drama, which is Andor, which is very kind of intense, and we had Mandalorian, which is very like dark and gritty and cynical. We've had Skeleton Crew, which is basically a fun kids show like the Goonies and other things like that in the 80s that we grew up in. And so yeah, I think we're seeing more and more like you can have all of these different genres that are just connected to, either the larger intellectual properties or just, in sci-fi kind of realms, but a sci-fi rom-com, a sci-fi comedy, a sci-fi, any of these kind of things.
Oh, I'm definitely seeing elements. I mean, spoiler, I'm a musical theater
Mm-hmm.
baby. That's my nerdery right there is musical
Right.
theater. And the amount of shows that have done musical episodes.
Yeah.
Or, I do love comedy, and watching The Orville was thrilling. I was laughing so hard. And then,
Mm-hmm.
as you know, I was crying so hard about
Yeah.
the deeply psychological, importance that
Right.
that show was giving. I'm finding all the things that I can relate to that don't necessarily have anything to do with nerd culture or mainstream culture.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it makes a lot of sense. And so, what are some of the things you're finding? Like, let me first ask, when you started this project, what were kind of your expectations about the kind of media you'd be experiencing?
Well, first of all, I've learned to forgive myself for not understanding some of it.
That's very
I,
fair.
and I'm a very intelligent person. It's not that. It's just that my brain is not wired to remember, seven different races all in a space battle. I can't
Mm-hmm.
remember. I can't follow the lore. And from the very beginning, all my beautiful nerds who are my friends and colleagues that come on to try to recruit me said, that's okay.
Yeah.
Let it go. If you don't understand everything, you will still get the story, get the excitement, get the romance. You'll get it all.
Right.
And um, that is a major shift for me, is like
Mm.
just almost not skimming. That's not the right word, but not getting bogged down in lingo I don't understand or
Right.
character references that make no sense to me. So it's much more enjoyable when I'm not feeling like, oh, I'm stupid. I don't get it. What are they
Yeah.
talking about? Ugh, they left me out again.
I'm pretty glad that I'm done with school. I got a college degree, a master's degree. I don't want to do more homework. And I
Yeah.
understand what you mean about, you know, there are some TV shows and books and movies and things where it feels like you really have got to do the homework to get it. And I totally understand why it's a lot of fun when you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. And I think I didn't realize this at the time, and maybe I'm just putting this together now, but my format is somewhat brilliant because I
Mm.
can say to you, so Matthew, that whole speech in the beginning, what the heck was that about? Right.
Yeah,
And
we'll
you're
do the
going to,
homework for you.
yes, you're going to say, oh, in the prequel, there's a world that we don't see in this one and that, and, or whatever. You're going to
Right.
explain it all to me. And I, I can just drink.
Yeah. And I think
I can
that's
just
a
have a glass of wine and relax and watch good stuff and take
hmm
what I take from it. And
Go ahead.
everything I, with the exception of two entities, one of them
Hmm.
being one of your choices,
Yep.
I've found something to love.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the key. One of my very first guests said, "Well, I'm not coming on your show so you can shit all over something I hold really dear." And
Yeah.
I said, "I would never.
Yeah.
I'm looking to embrace these things. I would never approach something looking to trash it.
Right.
But I understand that fear. These things are very, very precious to people."
I
And
think it, I think that's really true, and I think that's also part of the generational thing because, a lot of us grew up being having these things trashed or being trashed because
mhm,
of them, and that's not the case anymore. And I think most of us think that's wonderful. I think, like with anything in life, there's always some people who are like, "Oh, I miss the good old days when they want to gate creep who gets to be a nerd," which mostly means they want to keep out girls because they think girls don't talk to them, so girls must be bad. The misogyny in fandom is obviously a thing we can do far more episodes about. But I think that there's something really wonderful about getting to see things through someone else's eyes like that. And I've always found myself that I'm kind of in a middle position because with a lot of these things, I've done a lot of the homework, especially if it's, all the other shows and stuff. But a lot of the times, especially when it comes to comic books, I haven't read the comic books. And
mhm,
and I'm a big believer if I go to something and someone says, you'll have an even better understanding of it if you've read the comic book. I'm like, cool, okay, well then let me read about like comic books. Just the visual medium doesn't work in my brain, but let me at least read about them or have someone tell me about them the way
mhm.
you do. But if someone says, oh, you didn't like it because you hadn't seen the comic book and so therefore your opinion is not valid, I think there's nothing wrong with making a product that's only for people who've already seen all the other stuff. But then it's also okay to say that's not for me, And I love that you're able to really find what are the things that are still fairly accessible to you, even if you don't know all that background or whatever it is.
Right. Well, I have the benefit of someone who does to talk
Right.
me through it. But I've also found myself, if I can pull back and keep it big picture,
Mm-hmm.
I
Me
can
too.
just enjoy it.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and I think that's often the mark of the good media is the stuff that can be where the background might add more dimension and more to it, but you're still able to find something. You're able to understand it. You're able to, or at least understand it enough to get what's happening.
well, I compare it to Sesame Street because
Mm-hmm.
I thought my opinion of that show is that it was a masterpiece in keeping the humor accessible for 3-year-olds and 30-year-olds.
Yeah.
So there was always something for the parents to latch onto and find funny that would go over the kid's head and vice versa. And uh, with these things like you and I just talked about The Last of Us,
Mm-hmm.
it should appeal to those who have no background as
Right.
well as to loyalists who obsess over it.
Exactly.
And the good ones do. The good ones, I don't need to have read the book or
Yeah.
seen the first season, you know?
Right. I think that's so important. And I really, going back to the comment about people being kind of protective of these things, like I said, I think they can get to a problematic place. It can get to be gatekeepery, but I think the core idea of it's very important, especially with some of these properties that have had their bad periods and things like that, or have even with both within and without the fandom, people who are very negative about them. And I've really appreciated the way that you always go into, even with something like The Last of Us. That's the one that I suggested that you really didn't like, which I get. It's I think it's a very kind of high bar of entry in terms of being very very hard to watch, very kind of gruesome horror and things like that. But what I really appreciated was your attitude wasn't, oh Matthew, I can't believe you asked me to watch this. It was, Matthew, this didn't work for me, but I'm really curious why it worked for you. And I think
Yeah,
that's such a good model of how we can approach media that doesn't necessarily work for us.
absolutely. And I'm interested in you've said gatekeepery a couple times.
Hmm.
Is there a part of you, out of curiosity, you are a lifelong nerd. So when I say make me a nerd, is there a part of you that's like, screw you, you're late to the party?
There definitely is not, and I think
Okay.
probably for the majority of people in these worlds there isn't. But there definitely are parts of the world that are like that.
Hmm.
And I think that probably when um the nerd stuff first started to get popular, when I was in my 20s or so, late 20s, I think I probably had a little bit of that.
Hmm.
Um Mostly when it would be folks who I guess it's not something I'm proud of, but I think I can understand the sentiment. And I think where I maybe have a little bit of it still is when, because a lot of this stuff does have a lot of deep meaning and a lot of philosophy to it, a lot of ways that it's shaped kind of who I am. I think it's more when folks look at things on the most surface of level and kind of try to judge it or comment on it based on that very surface level. That's maybe where I still can be a little kind of like get my haunches up. And I think the gatekeeping aspect is overall just a negative thing that geeks should fight against. Um, but to me, I think because the way I want to approach everything in life, but especially this kind of media, is with a sense of wonder and curiosity.
Hmm.
Um, this is not geeky necessarily, but I think it's very beloved by geeks in the same way it is by music theater nerds. Music theater is of geeks and nerds and the like. But you've seen Ted Lasso, I assume.
Yes.
His speech about people who are judgmental instead of curious. I
Hmm.
think that anyone who, I've seen the people who are like, all right, I'm going to watch this one Star Wars movie so I can know enough about it to tell everybody how stupid they are for watching it. Like that's not something you want. Um, but the people who come in with a sense of curiosity, like clearly you did, I think is great. And I think it deserves curiosity back.
Hmm.
That when we do have someone who says, hey, like, one thing I think is really magical and beautiful that I'm seeing in Star Wars fandom all the time, and in geek fandom, and especially also in some of the games that I play, is people who are like, my kids are really into this, my grandkids are really into this, and I feel like that's it. If people are mostly coming to this out of that sense of curiosity, and so those of us who are in these communities, we should give that curiosity back. It shouldn't be judgmental. It shouldn't be, oh, how can you have not read this episode of this issue or whatever. It should be, hey, I'm glad you're here. I'm curious about what brought you here and how you think about it. And what do you see from not having seen all this for 40 years the way I did?
Absolutely. My mom, who sucks, she won't listen to this. I can say that. I love my mom, but
Mm-hmm.
she said, "I don't know how you're watching all that stupid stuff for your podcast."
Yeah.
And I got so offended, Matthew. A-
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "It's not for you, Mom, and that's okay. But it's
Right.
not stupid stuff just because it's not for you." And
Right.
I think she's the queen of judgment. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's eye-opening. Why do we do that?
Yeah.
Why is it either or, you know?
Well, it's really true. And I think, with science fiction and nerdery, I think there becomes kind of a chicken and the egg thing of, for a long time, it really was catered specifically towards, single white men, often the one who weren't, the most kind of socially competent by the established, often
Sure.
neurodivergent, things like that. And that becomes then a recurring stereotype of, oh, you're one of those antisocial types. If you watch this, therefore only those types watch that.
Mhm.
And in many ways, I think the internet was such a boon for those kind of cultures of letting people who are like, yeah, I'm not the best at a cocktail party, but if I can find my kind of people online and talk to them about it, we can build community. And remember, like, we're not all just the one kid getting shoved into the locker at school or whatever it is.
Right. Right. I I'm sure the advent of the internet launched all of this, and
Mm-hmm.
the when the MCU started making their movies and they were so star-studded and mainstream and
Right.
popular, that brought, I'm sure, a new generation back to comic books, back to superheroes, back
Mm-hmm.
to all of these fantastical things that, yeah, I mean, it is strange to think that these entities were created for that faction of society you just described.
Mm-hmm.
And the other night I was reading Fourth Wing. It's a
Mm-hmm.
romantasy, and I was sitting at a bar because I had to kill time waiting for my son. So I was sitting at the bar having a glass of wine, reading this romantasy book, and this mainstream, she looked like a Kardashian, ran over to me and said, "Oh, which one are you on? That's my favorite series. I've read them all. Oh, you're on the first one?" And
Mm-hmm.
we were talking and talking, and I thought, how remarkable, you
Yeah.
know? I mean, when a 20 something Kardashian looking woman runs up to me, I'm assuming she's like, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you need help?" I don't like, I'm amazed that she wanted to talk romantasy.
Mm-hmm. I get that. Well, and I'm happy to say, Riki Hayashi has been able to join us. Welcome, Riki. Give you a chance to
Hello.
meet Mandy Kaplan, host of the Make Me a Nerd podcast.
Hello, Riki.
Hello.
My fault.
Apologies.
I forgot to remind Riki that we were recording this week on this great topic. Riki, we've been talking though about sort of what it means to encounter geekery and nerdery at different stages in life and coming into these things. And I'm curious for you, you're someone who did you really kind of think of yourself as someone who grew up thinking of themselves as a nerd? Were you into, I know you've talked about liking anime as a kid, but things like science fiction and fantasy and stuff like that, was that always a part of and comic books, was that always part of your life?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Star Wars was one of the foundational pieces of media that I enjoyed as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't remember it myself, but my parents have told me that they took me to see Empire Strikes Back in the theater when I was barely a toddler. But Return of the Jedi was the movie that I remember seeing and being amazed. And we got it on VHS, and I actually also had like a audio cassette like version of it.
Uh-huh.
Not like the whole movie, but kind of like a summary. And I listened to that all the time. I watched the movie all the time, and then back to back years like Ghostbusters and Back to the Future, which are kind of like soft sci-fi slash fantasy, were movies that really compelled me. And then yes, growing up, I watched a lot of anime, comic book stuff. I don't remember when I got into. I think that was more kind of like backdoored via like Batman the Animated Series,
Mm-hmm.
and then I got into the physical comic books themselves. And of course, I am Japanese, and there's the stereotype that Asians are into anime, drawing, that kind of stuff, and I did do a little bit of that as a kid, and I had friends who were into that, and we talked about things, like Robotech, Dragon Ball, etc. So yeah, like I would say that I have always been a geek as far back as I can remember.
Nice. Yeah. No, that I think is very much kind of where I was coming from as well. But I love hearing that it's also in very different directions. Like anime was something that I think I was very like on the outskirts aware of, but wasn't really a part of my life until much later in my life. Certainly drawing, I can't draw water, so I'm always impressed by those who can get into that kind of stuff.
I wasn't that good. I
Mm-hmm.
remember I had two friends that were really good at drawing like robots and stuff. And I
Yeah.
would try, but I never, I would say I never put as much effort into it as they did. So they were just more practiced and better at it.
Nice.
It ended up I was like better at writing than
Mm-hmm.
drawing.
Well, and Manny, you were just telling this great story about kind of meeting a total stranger who who was really into the same kind of like romantasy book that you were reading.
Mhm.
And it reminds me, I think it's kind of a really wonderful statement about where we've gotten to in our culture. And, earlier I was talking about the stereotype of, from the 50s, 60s, 70s of like, sci fi fantasy was only the realm of like neurodivergent white men. And I think that's never really been the case. There's always been lots of it around for all sorts of people, but that was very much the stereotype that got. And so that was the stuff that if anything was picked up by bigger studios, that's what was picked up. But when I was growing up, my mother would always tell me that it's important to get by in society. You need to know enough about sports to be able to talk about the game last night. And as it turns out, I'm a huge sports fan. But what she meant was like people are going to talk to you at the water cooler, at the wedding, at whatever social gathering you are about the game, whatever sport it was. And so it's good to know enough to be able to converse about that. And I think now it's funny that now I do get people being like, "Hey Matthew, what's the new big Marvel thing?" Because I'm going to, my high school reunion and I want to be able to talk about this stuff, or I'm going to my cousin's wedding and I know someone's going to ask me about the new Star Wars. What's the new Star Wars? And like, there's a part of me that at the time and still feels like there's nothing you should know about just because you can talk about other people. But it is a sign of just how much we've changed that now those are the mainstream conversations for a lot of people. Not for everybody by any means, but for a lot of us.
Probably streamers had a lot to do with that, that
Mm-hmm.
they could bring back beloved shows that people could watch again, or reboots of things, or, Game of Thrones became such a huge water cooler thing.
Right.
And without streamers, I don't know that any of those things would have been made. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely true.
little theory. And
I hear.
Ricky,
Yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
Ricky, is that like paraphernalia and toys behind you?
Oh yeah. On the video feed, yeah, I have a wall it's mostly Pokemon stuff because
Yep.
I did stream Pokemon Go battles for a while, so that's
Ooh,
just kind of my default background.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's other like anime paraphernalia as well.
it's so funny. Whenever I have a guest on, they're like, "Hi," and all I see in the background are action figures and comic books, and all the fun merch that goes with being a true fan about these things. So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, no, definitely like post like Zoom meeting era, everyone kind of has to think about like what's in their background, and it's like a bookshelf, and do you want to be taken seriously? Do you have all the psychology books and history books, or do you have toys?
right.
Yeah.
Why not have toys?
Uh,
Like I love this stuff.
my camera's currently not working, but I have a bookcase behind me that I've very carefully curated, and there's a top row that's all my like philosophy and religion and ethical textbooks that I go to, and then the next row is all like Dungeons and Dragons and vampire books and things like that, and
Yeah.
just showing off all the different sides.
My problem is that I was a history major in school, so all of my serious history books are like World War II and Hitler, and I'm like, I don't want to have that on my bookshelf behind me.
No,
Yeah,
thank you.
no, I own a copy of Mein Kampf because I wanted to read it, wanted to understand that level of evil, but that's something that's going to be badly misunderstood. So I get that.
I
Um,
I want to go back, Matthew, to what you're saying about sports because it's
mhm,
interesting. To me, sports is a geeky thing
right,
because I grew up in kind of like the sabermetrics revolution, right? The Moneyball era, and statistics and like studying them, and fantasy baseball, like all the fantasy sports has really like bridged that gap between jocks and nerds, has been like the traditional stereotypical divide. And I like there are so many econ graduates from Yale and stuff in baseball, like working in baseball as general managers and stuff like that now, that I really like think that divide is pretty artificial these days, in
hmm
my opinion.
I
I think
hope
that,
so.
go ahead. Yeah, please, Jenny,
Well,
go ahead.
there's in doing my podcast, it started off as, if you're obsessed with sci-fi or fantasy or anime or comic books, come on my podcast and share your passion with me, and get me excited about it too. But then I realized using the word nerd is broader than that. Like, I am nerdy about musical theater. I am nerdy about Top Chef.
Mm,
So those aren't nerd entities necessarily. Musical
Right.
theater is a little borderline, but I'm nerdy about that. So I've done some episodes where, like, I did Survivor, because I've never watched
oh
Survivor.
my gosh, I love
And
Survivor.
right, and my guest is the editor in chief of uh, Entertainment Weekly, whose beat is covering Survivor for the past 15 years. So he knows everything. He's obsessed
Yeah.
and knowledgeable and nerdy about it.
Right.
And so I think it's interesting to switch up what we're nerdy about, and it's not just geek culture anymore.
And
Yeah, I think.
specifically Survivor, like those kinds of reality TV competitions really play into game theory, which
Yep,
is like
Hmm.
a more traditional nerd avenue.
Right.
totally.
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense because I think you're right that there's something. I think a lot of what the original term, back up, I think a lot of the way people often used to use the word nerd, and maybe sometimes still do, is it's not just about what you're interested in; it's the way you're interested in it. In terms of like, is it a show that you turn on Thursday night and watch and maybe talk about on Friday morning, and then go about your day? Or is it something that you collect paraphernalia about or make charts about, what planet appeared when or what recipe appeared when? Like to me, the person who wants to create a chart that lists all the different planets that different Star Trek episodes go to, and the person who creates a chart of all the different times that they cook scallops on Top Chef and how
He's
like there's
not top scallop.
yeah, exactly. Love him so much. Um, um, you know it's the same kind of feeling, and therefore it applies to sports. And I think there's a lot of great stuff that's been talking about how fantasy football, fantasy baseball, it's kind of like it's D&D for people who are afraid to play D&D. Not I love those things. I'm not saying you have to, if you do those you have to play D&D, but like there still is some stigma among certain parts of the population. They're like, oh, D&D, that's a nerdy thing. It's all focusing on the numbers, but then doing that all the numbers with fantasy football, that's totally okay. When they're both, I think, just as much a fun pursuit of really diving deep into something and learning all about it, and then trying to use that to your favor.
Yeah. And even fantasy sports, I think, did for a long time carry a bit of a stigma, even among sports fans. But
Mm-hmm.
nowadays, with the online sports betting, even if you're not in like an actual fantasy sports league, everyone is playing fantasy sports because you are trying to predict outcomes, and you are studying the players and the teams. Like, oh, like this player has an advantage, this batter has an advantage against this pitcher, so I want to play this particular parlay. That's just fantasy sports.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which I
Well,
am nerdy about. Fantasy football.
and that's great. That's great. I'd love to have a podcasters league. Um, that could be really
Maybe we
fun.
should talk about that. It's been a long time. I'm a little bit out of it.
Well,
But I also
I used to always get in trouble in fantasy football because I would, if there was a very good jet available, I would pick him even though maybe there was someone better.
I'm
But
sorry. I'm sorry. Can you back up? Did you say a good jet?
well, no, that's my point. Is that now that there's no one good on the New York Jets anymore, I don't have that problem.
Yeah.
I just can't pick a Patriot ever. But
Oh,
let,
Matthew, let's
let,
go.
let me pull us back to our main topic.
if
Mhm.
you want to win, you got to get over that stuff.
No. Getting I'll never draft a Yankee either. But getting back to this, Mandy. So in the stuff you've been experiencing, so Riki, just bringing fully up to speed on Mandy's podcast, Make Me a Nerd. Each week, someone comes on, and she said, kind of introduces her to their favorite, part. So I did Orville and Penguin and The Last of Us. Other people have done other things. Mandy, what are some of the things in particular that you've been surprised by, or yeah, let's just go with that. Like where you may have had one kind of idea of it, or you had no idea what it was, but then you came out of that episode and watching that with it surprised you, or it showed you something different.
Well, I'll say the Orville, not just because I adore you and you came on the podcast, but I didn't think I would be crying and
Mm.
moved and so invested in the characters. That really shocked me.
Mm.
And the other one I would have to say is Severance. My husband said, "You won't like it. It's like sci-fi and weird and dark. You won't like it. It's not for you." And I said, "Okay, thanks. I won't watch it." And despite the fact that everyone in the world loved it, I was like, "Nope, I've heard it's not for me. Can't do it." And I did it for the podcast. And I only promised I'll watch like the first couple of episodes to get the conversation going. And I didn't leave my room for 2 days straight. I binged every episode. I loved it so deeply. I think it's absolutely genius and exciting. And I should divorce my husband because why was he trying to keep me away from it?
Mm-hmm.
But he was right. Usually I would watch something with like, oh, they alter their brains. And I would be like, I'm out. That's not for me.
Right.
But oh man.
And what pulled you into it?
Um, the concept was exciting. It's like Stepford Wives or that the weird remake Don't Worry Darling. I like those thoughtful, twisted ideas. How far would you go
Right.
to cure your pain or to make your life better? Would you surgically alter yourself or someone else? Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is one of my favorite movies, and I think Severance is very close to that. And so and the world was so beautifully constructed and the set design is so masterful. There's nothing to not like about Severance.
Mm-hmm.
But I normally would have just never tried it if not for this podcast.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, even that one was a little. I think there's a couple of different schools of science fiction, and one of them is like it's going to be very kind of ethereal almost, and like you never, as the reader or the watcher, quite understand what's happening. And those tend to be ones that I really wrestle with. But Severance, and we have some thoughts on the ending. And by the way, I'm afraid to tell you that you may have just volunteered for our podcast episode on this most recent season about Severance that we're going to do sometime soon.
Bring it
But
on.
I really love that that's a show where it obviously has some interesting points it wants to make, but it's really not okay. It's not afraid of being just bizarre at times. Like there are things that happen that I love shows that have like a well constructed lore and everything really fits and makes sense. And Severance does in a way, but there's a lot of things where it's like, okay, there's going to be some random thing, but why a waffle party? Why a melon party?
Melon parties. Oh.
Like these things are just so random and weird, and yet they work so well because they're in this larger narrative. Yeah, it's asking these hard questions about how far can office drudgery go, and on the flip side, how far can our desire for, denial of our own emotions and denial of that part of us that feels these things we don't want to feel, and so being able to take those incredibly relatable questions and put them in this totally bizarre environment, it works in a way you wouldn't think.
And I don't know, but I imagine the Severance must have been born out of somebody saying, if I could just flick a switch and cure my grief, if I could just turn this pain off, I would do anything for that. And it's like, well, there's your whole concept. Everything falls into place.
Mm-hmm.
And we've all felt that, I assume. We've all grieved.
Right.
And wished we could just turn it off.
Yeah, I think I heard it was either Ben Stiller or Adam Scott talking about it, about the concept of work, like the work day at an office and the disassociation and kind of the two lives syndrome, like you have your work life and your home life type of thing. And yeah, just making something out of that concept is fascinating. And I think the mystery box aspects, say what you will about J.J. Abrams not being able to tell us what's actually in his mystery box, but he constructs a good box in the beginning of all of his products. And I think they're amazing and they draw you in. And it's just, I think part of it is maybe fandom itself, like the discussions that we have on podcasts like this and the speculation maybe gets out of control and we speculate too much, and then it's impossible to satisfy everyone because we all have our own theories.
Right.
Although interestingly, yes, this is a new phenomenon and Reddit did not exist 40 years ago. I get that. But when JR got shot, my memory of that was like the world could talk about nothing else. And there were fan theories and people getting into arguments in bars. Like, no, it had to be, I don't even know the character names, but I just remember who shot JR was just ubiquitous. And so this has always existed to some degree. And that was a nighttime soap, but they got people doing what we do about, fan theories on Reddit.
When they'd had one season where Bobby got killed and they found out that it was all a dream, as one of the best writers, like, oops, we screwed up. Let's just unwrite this whole season, Like, I remember Dallas and that, it being, and I think that's in many ways one of the most, that's the way really you got to grab the social zeitgeist these days, is something that puts out a question that people are going to want to discuss, and it's, a lot of us don't work in offices with a water cooler anymore.
Right.
I never have, I'll be honest, in any real way, other than like, temp jobs and stuff to pay for college. But through the internet, through, any place where people gather, those are the things that spark the attention. And I think part of why I think your project is so interesting is because it really dovetails so well with the whole project of superhero ethics, because to me, the thing I've always found most exciting about all this media is, spaceships are cool and lightsabers are fun and like the special effects are great, but I like talking about ethical questions. And I think a lot of people are really sick of discussing politics and discussing ethics and stuff like that. But if you go up to someone and say, "Hey, did you watch that show about the alien race that has this weird practice? What did you think?" It gets people talking because it's kind of like a sneaky way into them realizing, what do you think of the actual thing in our own world that that alien practice was happening as a metaphor for? You know, and in Orville,
Yeah,
we talked about that so much that it's,
right.
yeah, what if there was a planet all of men? It's kind of a fun thought experiment, but really it gets you thinking about, how do we think of a gender in our own world, or with any of those questions.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I, I I have marveled at how many times politics have come up because I watched one of these TV shows or movies, and some of it is highly intentional to comment
Mm-hmm.
on on today's society and what we're going through, and some of it I don't think is intentional.
Right.
And it's just it's the human experience. It keeps repeating itself, and it keeps coming up in our fiction.
Right. Riki, do you have a memory of what was kind of the first piece of media like that really kind of hit you hard and got you, like you talked about how these things really shaped you in a lot of ways, of what was the first thing that hit you in a way where beyond just like, oh, this is really fun, or I like watching this, something that really left you thinking in some way?
I don't. It was probably more books. I'm trying to think because Star Trek: The Next Generation did have a lot of good episodes that dealt with that.
Mm-hmm.
But I really feel like it wasn't until I started reading science fiction, especially Ender's Game and that whole
Mhm.
series, Speaker of the Dead in
Yep.
particular, was just for my like reading science fiction fandom was very foundational in making me think about stuff and making me think about humanity and like human beings and how societies work and interact and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I would say is like more reading science fiction. I read a lot of Heinlein, like post high
Mm-hmm.
school graduation. So he's got some weird books, but he also had some ideas about like what society would become, which
Right.
have so far not proved to be fruitful. But I think it was that idea of speculation and of thinking about what humanity could become that
Right.
really drew me to a lot of his writing.
And what about you, Matthew? What was the thing that made you get deep?
For me, it was Star Trek, but it happened in kind of an intentional way because from a fairly young age, my mother would sit me down and watch episodes of the original Star Trek. I was in kind of middle school, high school by the time Next Generation was coming out. But we'd sit down and watch these episodes, and then she would ask me about them, and she'd talk to me about, so yeah, these people who have, some people have black on their face and white on their face, and the others have those two colors but reversed. Like, did that make you think of anything, that you know about and stuff like that? And and it started, I mean, that's kind of a deeper question. Some of it started from very young age, but she would sit down and watch these things with me and then talk about them with me. And I think that's she really kind of so that kind of really got me started on this whole idea of geeky media is, yeah, spaceships are great and it's the special effects are really fun, and that's fun to watch. But also it can really kind of be ways to engage in questions in new ways. And that's something that I've always really loved.
Yeah, that's the thing for me. My original kind of watch of Star Trek: The Next Generation was more like starships and aliens and all that kind of stuff, the Borg. But it was because that show, when it was syndicated, was on all the time on one of the networks, right? And my
Mm-hmm.
friends and I would watch every day, just like a 3 hour block of it. And so it was on that repeat viewing when you already know the plot, you already know all of the spaceships and stuff, that I started to notice and started to pay attention to things.
Mm, I can see that. Well, we've gone over about an hour, and I don't want to keep Mandy too long, but I think, Mandy, you're definitely going to be a repeat guest. Um,
Yeah.
I want to give you kind of a closing word, and then for our members, we are going to have a bonus section that we'll get to in just a second. But Mandy, before that, give people a little bit more about how they can find more of your stuff.
Oh, Make Me a Nerd is available wherever you podcast. It's a production of True Story, uh, the family. And yeah, I'm on social media at Mandy_Kaplan_Clavens, both with K's. And I'm on Blue Sky now at Mandy Miscast. And Miscast is the name of my cabaret I do in Los Angeles every 3 months, all for laughs and all for charity.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, well, it's been great having you on. We'll definitely have you back. And let me just ask, what's one thing that you have seen on your podcast that you now have become kind of you're now telling other people about?
Oh boy, there's a lot. Um, the Penguin I turned a lot of people onto.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess everyone had already seen Severance. Um, I'm trying to think of the more like obscure ones.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, you caught me off guard because I'm that idiot at a dinner party who's like, I've never seen Game of Thrones. I've never seen Star Trek. Like that's me, or
Yeah.
not me anymore, not the new me. But
I've never
um,
seen Game of Thrones.
oh, Riki. But so I think most of what I'm doing is so loved. I'm not discovering a little indie film and spreading the word
Mm-hmm.
about it. Although here's one. There's a documentary from the mid 90s, Seth Gordon, called King of Kong. Do you know this movie?
Oh
I
yeah.
don't know. Oh,
It is
you do, Ricky?
so
Yes.
it is it's like Waiting for Guffman, but it's really a documentary about these two competing Donkey Kong players and how seriously they took their endeavors to
Yeah.
be the
The
champion Donkey Kong
the
player.
arcade version, the arcade cabin
Yeah.
version.
Oh, that's
And they're trying
fascinating.
to get the high score.
So
And this
yeah,
is all before like online, speed run high score culture too.
Mm-hmm.
it's it's weird and interesting and absolutely hilarious. I've never laughed so hard on my podcast. I couldn't speak because we were reminiscing about these very interesting guys and how seriously they take this. So,
I
King
love
of
that.
Kong.
I love that. Okay, cool. Definitely worth checking out. Well, Manny, thank you so much. Riki, as always, thank you for this, especially just jumping on last minute. My fault for not kind of poking you about it. For our members, of course, please stick around. We're going to have a bonus member section in just a moment. And it's going to include information about a new podcast idea that Mandy and I are going to be kicking off pretty soon. And of course, to become a member, it's just $5 a month, $55 a year. All the information about how to join is in our show notes. And as Mandy mentioned, her podcast is on truestory.fm. So is this podcast. We're both parts of that True Story family of podcasts, as is also the Marvel Movie Minute podcast, which I will be appearing on in the summer and fall, talking about Thor 2, The Dark World, trying very hard to find things in that movie to enjoy. I'm somewhat successful, but mostly try very hilariously to talk about the things I don't enjoy. But all that's on True Story family of
Damn.
podcasts. Check it out. It's all worthwhile. So hopefully you are going to stick around for our members, but for everybody else, thank you so much. We have spoken. Welcome back, members. Thanks so much. We're just going to do a quick thing because I know people have to go, but I'm going to ask you both. Let me start again. But I mentioned briefly that Mandy and I, along with Pete Wright, are thinking about starting a new podcast because, as it happens, I'm starting on a new adventure in life that Mandy and Pete have already gone through some parts of, which is that in about 2 months, Mary, my spouse, is going to hopefully give birth to our first child. And so we're talking about having a podcast about parenting, about what advice to more experienced parents would give to a new one. Granted that the first episode will probably be both of them advising me not to start a podcast when becoming a new parent. But beyond that, and one thing we're going to look at a lot is the way parenting is portrayed in media. So, Riki, I'll let you go last since you're completely surprised by this idea. But Mandy, I'll start with you. Just as a quick bonus, I want to talk about what's kind of one or two of your favorite examples of parenting in movies or TV.
If I mention them here, can we still talk about them on the podcast?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, because it was so easy. The best parents for me were Stephen and Elise Keaton on Family Ties.
Yep.
I think everyone thought, oh, if that could be my parent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Compassionate. They had strict boundaries. They were loving and funny. And Stephen and Elise for the win. And then in film, I'm a huge Parenthood fan.
Oh, that was
And
one I was going to mention. That
oh,
movie is
sorry,
so good.
I stole it.
There you
Steve
go.
Martin in Parenthood. Just the way he cares about Kevin and does
Mm-hmm.
1,000 pop flies in the backyard. Oh,
Stephen
so
and Diane Weiss, who's another parent in the movie. It's just a wonderful movie about the struggles of parenthood. It's one I'm planning to rewatch sometime soon. And among other things, Riki, I don't know if you've seen this movie. It has one of my favorite Keanu Reeves roles.
oh,
All
he's
he had done up to this point
fantastic.
was Bill and
Oh,
Ted's
yeah,
Excellent
yeah.
Adventure, and he plays basically the same character, who is, an idiot and a stoner, but also has like one or two moments of just the deepest wisdom you're ever going to hear. And it was just kind of like early days when people were like, "Oh, I love Keanu Reeves for Bill and Ted." I was like, "No, no, no, you got to see him in Parenthood." So, no, that's a great deep cut. Um, Parenthood is definitely one I was going to mention, but the one I'm going to mention is Coach and Mrs. Taylor from Friday Night Lights,
Oh,
uh,
sure.
which oh God, I can't. She's Tammy. I can't remember what his first name is because for me, he will just always be Coach. Um, but and I think the part of it that really struck me was how willing they are to admit when they're wrong. Um, they're not perfect parents. They do screw up. They do have moments where they're angry at the other parent or they're angry at their situation and they project it onto their child, and or they're something else like that. And the willingness they have to acknowledge that, to admit that, to deal with hard situations. He's a football coach whose star quarterback is dating his daughter, and he gives the kid some advice about what he thinks of as just manly advice to a young quarterback about how to score with a girl without realizing it's his daughter, and that makes him kind of think about like what's the advice he as a man gives to high school boys, and isn't that problematic in some ways? And it's played for both comedy and seriousness. Their daughter goes through a lot of trouble, but is just comes out okay and has some wonderful things go along. And yeah, they're just it's their willingness to acknowledge and admit their mistakes that really just makes me kind of love them as mentors and heroes.
It's a good one, Matthew.
Yeah.
Nice work.
Riki, what about you?
So I don't know what this says about me and my ideas of parenthood. I am not a parent,
Joan Crawford and Mommy Dearest.
but for me, it is about the found family trope. And
Mm-hmm.
specifically, I'm thinking of Star Wars Rebels, where Kanan
Mm,
Jarrus and Hera Syndulla are the quote unquote parents for this
right.
family. They're not their actual children, but they are a group of rebels fighting together, and they are, of an older generation and do take on mentoring roles and care for the other people in their
Mm-hmm.
group. So I really like that. And the other one I thought of was Joyce Byers in Stranger Things,
Oh,
Oh
especially
yeah.
season 1, because she is so relentless in trying to get her son back, Will Byers,
hmm
Mm-hmm.
back from, what was it called, the Upside Down. They didn't call it that at the time,
Right.
but she, the way, like, that season to me was her season,
Mm-hmm.
and what she does and goes through in order to get her son back, and in the face of people, who just don't believe her and don't help her, was just remarkable. And I, so that would be like my real, quote unquote, real parent, right? Like, that would just do anything for her
Mm-hmm.
child, and I love that.
Yeah. No, it's really beautiful. The one other one that I will mention because it's my podcast, I get to close out, is and it's more because of the way they relate to each other. In the movie Ant-Man and then Ant-Man the Second, we start with one of the classic tropes that I think is an example of awful parenting and awful, being an adult, which is the traditional trope where our hero is kind of down on his luck and is divorced and doesn't have a good relationship with his kid. And there's a stepfather now involved. And almost all the time in the trope, while our hero is out saving the world, at some point in time, he also embarrasses and humiliates the stepfather and wins back the love of his child, and often wins back the love of the woman who, had so cruelly left him just because he got drunk and cheated on her all the time, or, whatever it was. And in Ant-Man and Ant-Man 2, they kind of start out with that dynamic. But what winds up happening is that our main character winds up becoming a really beautiful example of a co-parent, where he comes to respect that, yeah, he can have a better relationship with his ex-wife, and she can forgive him and understand him, and he can understand her, and they can be friends and co-parents, and he can recognize that this other man can make her life happy and also be a good co-parent. And there's just ways in which the three of them interact as parents together, that as a child of divorce, who, my mother and my stepmother almost never spoke to each other, it was just such a beautiful, like, flipping of that trope on its head in a way I really loved.
Yeah, that's nice. That also has the Hank Pym,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And Hope.
Yep.
That dynamic is less central, but I think is a very good one.
I mean, the MCU is pretty big on the idea that if you're a hero, you've got daddy issues of some kind or another. So, that's just a thing, and definitely will be a topic we discuss on that podcast, which may well be named "The Once and Future Parents." We'll see. But for now, thank you so much to our members. Thank you so much to Mandy and Riki, my wonderful guests. Live long and prosper.
And I, of
And we're out.
course,